If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Yo, man, it's getting hot in here. Is that global warming?
Yes, it is. Maybe it's just hot in here.
Did you forget it? They changed it. It's climate change, bro.
Yeah, climate change, right, of course. So that's what we'll be addressing today. And so basically, for me, I didn't really have a stance on climate change prior. So I had to do my homework, and my conclusion was, a lot of people take this topic very seriously, and I wasn't taking it seriously prior. So I thought it was a good idea for us to kind of take a different approach, as opposed to telling the listeners what to think, but telling them how to think, how to approach this topic, because it does touch people's hearts in a way that I didn't expect. So I want to equip the listener, to be able to navigate media when they're presenting climate change or climate change arguments. So we'll be looking at behavioral economics, which is the merger of psychology and economics and how the human brain works.
And then blends into political science / policy. Yeah.
So this is going to be a lot of fun and take a different angle on looking at climate change. So to start, Joel got into a little Twitter beef.
Well, one-sided. They didn't really respond.
Yeah, they didn't really respond.
But I was listening to this podcast called "This Is Why," and the podcast episode was the titled "Climate Change: Not Just a Political Issue." I took some issues with, let's say, how the anyone who critiques or is concerned with government intervention respect of climate change is pretty much put into this category of like climate change denier, a skeptic, rather than, it's just, in my opinion, poor. It's not intellectually honest. There's a lot of it's not as simple as like either you're pro climate change, or pro is not even necessarily the right word. Either you're in agreement with climate change and therefore the government must solve the problem, or the dichotomy is like, or you're anti-science. Mm-hmm. And really I would say you're probably going to see a spectrum on with regards to both sides of that. So the spectrum, in my opinion, is really from in agreement and government should do something, to in agreement, questioning what the government solutions are, to maybe not in full agreement and concerned that even if a government is right, government action, or sorry, not the government's right, the science is settled, government interventions are actually a net negative today. And the better solutions would be to address problems as they arise, and then getting down, continuing on that spectrum to the idea of like questioning the science, not so much from a climate is changing perspective, but as to how much, using the term that's thrown around is anthropopic. I can't even say that word properly, but the idea of man-made, or predominantly the changes we see today are caused by man and
mm-hmm. The name of the podcast is called This Is Why. It's produced by Global, and they were addressing the issue of Maxime Bernier calling out 16-year-old Swedish climate change activist Greta Thunberg. So he made some comments about her on Twitter basically saying that she's a political pawn, and made some comments about her mental health.
Yeah, which was really dumb. I mean, I think he had. I think there's a fair criticism that when that she's being used as a political pawn, in that she believes something and she's acting on it, but I can guarantee you she couldn't handle a debate on the science of this topic.
Well, she's won a Nobel Peace Prize, right?
Yeah, so did Obama.
Yeah, well.
For nothing to do with peace, but it's called the Peace Prize.
On Friday, September 27th, thousands of young people around the world held a climate change strike. In Canada, we had 85 cities taking part in it. This was inspired by Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old girl from Sweden who is an activist in the climate change movement. I was listening to Albert Mohler's The Briefing episode on this climate change strike around the world held by many young people. I wanted to get into a little bit more about her background to let you guys kind of know what's going on here and how is she becoming a celebrity activist. So Standpoint Magazine, that's a major intellectual journal published in Great Britain. It tells the story. The reporter is Dominic Green. He writes, Greta Thunberg is just an ordinary 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirl whose fiery visions have convinced the parliaments of Britain and Ireland to declare a climate change emergency. He says that the Greta phenomena has also involved green lobbyists, PR hustlers, eco-academics, and a think tank founded by a wealthy ex-government minister in Sweden's social democratic government with links to the country's energy companies. These companies, he tells us, are preparing for the biggest bonanza of government contracts in history, the greening of the Western economies. Greta, whether she and her parents know it or not, is the face of their political strategy. This has also led to other young people pushing for climate change, like Emma Lima from McGill University in Montreal, who was pushing for a baby strike. No future, no children. And the event that kind of has got people talking was her talk at the UN Climate Action Summit in New York. And so basically she was arguing for the human rights of the 1989 Convention on the Rights of Children. And basically she was saying that the carbon emissions were too high in the countries of Argentina, Brazil, France, Turkey, and Germany. I'm going to play a snippet from her UN speech, and then we'll talk about that.
My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
Okay, so of course we got to cut it off after her wonderful economic reference of fairy tales of eternal economic growth. I mean, honestly, when I hear her say that, I just cringe because I know it's a highly ignorant statement, first off. I don't even think she knows what that means. And the reason I say that is because the legitimate economic positions in this conversation are that essentially, and this is people who would assume, like, I mean, Bob Murphy's the kind of who I'm quoting here. He assumes all the IPCC data and uses that to do some economic analysis to say it would be more economically efficient to deal with the problems of climate change as they arise rather than trying to make the change today. And again, this is based on using IPCC's data. It's not that he's saying like, oh, you know, I'm going to use a different set of data. And so the economics that she's kind of mocking is saying that by not taxing people today and taking that money out of growth and prosperity, and pulling back on consumption of the cheapest form of energy, and trying to shift us sooner to limit the warming, because the IPCC's predictions are saying, you know, if we can limit warming to 1.6 degrees if we do X, Y, and Z, or potentially limit to that level. So again, the point I'm trying to make is, of course, we're going to jump on the economic statement. I'll share the Bob Murphy stuff that I've got. But there's an article that's both in audio and text format. The audio format's on what's called the Radio Rothbart, and I'll make sure I put that in the show notes page. But the headline is Greta Thunberg to poor countries drop dead. And the purpose of the argument is to basically say when she includes countries like Brazil and Turkey on her list, Ryan Macon in the article said, including them on this list is bizarre and borders on sadistic, assuming she actually knows about the situation in those places. And what he gets at is that, you know, the use of fossil fuels and cheap energy in those countries is what's needed to get them to even approach first world conditions. So, you know, by pushing them back farther, you're forcing them to essentially lower their standard of living, and they're not even, you know, barely above basic needs being sustained. So, I mean, those are, you know, that's my first kind of critique. I think there's or first response to that economics. I think there's also some pretty good memes that are just kind of blowing up. I've been loving the memes that are coming out, but in line with what I just said, there's a picture of her on a train and quoting her, which she said, "How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words." And she's like eating bread on a train, traveling. But the meme shows a war-torn country with 3 little kids saying, "Really?" And I think it captures what Ryan's article was talking about, and really, I think it demonstrates kind of the ignorance of her fairy tales of eternal economic growth, because it's really a straw man of the economics arguments that do exist. There's a whole bunch of memes though that I think mock her well, and when I say well, I mean, you know, things like, oh, you're gonna. There's another meme that says, oh, you're lecturing the U.S. and the EU, but you add their emissions combined, and China's way ahead of them, but you're not speaking to, you know, China. Mm-hmm. And it's just the idea that there's so much more depth to this, you know, issue, as well as, you know, to the fact that to some extent she's picking and choosing where she's, putting forth her complaint. I guess the last thing is that there's a meme where she's wearing anti-fascist all-stars t-shirt, and she apologized saying, "Oh, I just borrowed it from a friend." The problem is there's 2 pictures in addition of her parents also wearing the same shirt. And in essence, Antifa are fascists, and really they're promoting, you know, a way of life that probably most people who are in agreement with climate change aren't fond of. Let's just put it that way. I mean, I know that there's been some claim that Antifa has been recognized as a domestic terrorist organization in the U.S. I don't know how legit that was, but I do remember seeing headlines of that. So, Darnell, what are your what's your first thoughts on what she had to say?
Well, for me, like, I come from like a Pentecostal background, so I'm used to hearing a lot of sermons with a lot of emotion. So I'm very weary of it, and listening to her speech, it sounded like a bad youth Sunday sermon. And just in general, I don't like people trying to get. I feel like I don't like the feeling of someone trying to get over on me by appealing to my emotions. But I rather appeal to my intellect first and then my emotions. So I'm always weary of it. And of course, she has a right to be passionate, and that's good. But being passionate is good. But some of her language was very harsh, and I didn't think that the topic warranted it. So it was just something I was just like, it sounded like a sermon, like she was, being presented as a savior, and she's presenting a gospel, like she's like, it's like Sola Greta, like Greta alone, like her, like this doctrine is going to save you. And I felt like I was sitting in a sermon or in a service. Yeah.
Yeah, where they're trying to preach to you out of conviction.
Yeah. Out of emotionalism and trying to get me to do the altar call and, easy believism.
Convict you into the altar call.
Yeah,
as
and then collect the
letting
tithe
the
after.
Holy Spirit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a whole nother ball game, or a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, but that's
prosperity gospel
yeah,
preacher.
I
I think there's one other aspect that I think I can touch on that, and that is, this isn't the first time that this has been done. Right? Like this, using children to appeal to emotion. I mean, in 1992, David Suzuki's daughter did the exact same thing. I mean, it's, Tim Moen had the post that kind of showed me this or brought my attention, and also linked to the video. He had a good statement saying it not as militant, hyperbolic, and divisive as the latest messaging, but obviously trotting out frightened kids is a useful tactic. The crazy thing, and I shared this meme, not to say that I fully endorse it on all levels, but there's a meme that basically said there are many different actors, but it's always the same script. And it essentially shows some socialist leaders with children, Hitler being one of them, and then the last picture is Greta with Obama. And again, I'm not trying to necessarily associate Obama with these socialist leaders, but the concept is very much the same. You're bringing children to appeal to people's emotions, as opposed to presenting them with a strong intellectual argument. So, I mean, that's my. I was very frustrated watching it. I mean, I was almost cringing. It was just, and I guess I can just to wrap up this conversation about her, role in this is there's a article in the Global News. It was a commentary. Was the first part of the headline saying climate change discussion needs to get back to science. And that would be, I think, really sums up my position on the whole Greta Thunberg fiasco.
So just throughout the show, we're going to be looking at kind of taking a step back from the news and the media and looking at, okay, well, how do we think about the media? What influences the way we think? So, for example, we're gonna look at behavioral economics, and like I said before, it's the combination of psychology and economics. And so one concept we want to look at is, why do we need behavioral economics? So certain types of problems humans are prone to, like, so poor decision making. So by understanding when we make those mistakes, then we can kind of avoid them. So just real quickly, the difference, and follow me, Joel. So we have economics, and then you have how humans think. So I'm doing a little comparison contrast. So I'm going to just name a couple things. So for economics, it's more, well, it's analytical, and then humans are emotional. Humans are reflexive. Economics is reflective. Humans are effortless, and humans are effortless, and economics is effortful. Humans are impulsive. Economics is deliberative. Humans are short-sighted, and economics is patient. The concept is basically this. Economics argues that man should be thinking rationally, and then behavioral economics says that humans act irrationally. I think both are true. Not in a contradictory way. I mean, so for example, if I'm not economically savvy, I'm going to make irrational decisions.
And I think that view is the basis for behavioral economics, and I think it's hot garbage.
Okay.
Because I think it's conflating the terms of irrational and bad decisions.
So what's the difference that you would say?
So irrational would be, I want breakfast, so I went and took a poop. Like, there's no logic involved.
Yeah.
Right? That's not a rational thought. Right? Whereas, you think of the case of an addict, they would say they're acting irrationally. But that's because you're an objective outsider who says, oh, if you want to be better in the long run, you need to quit, this drug that you're on that's ruining your life. And the fact that the addict continues to go back to the drugs is deemed irrational because for their longevity, it's actually a bad decision. But the rationality is the idea that the addict consciously makes the decision in the moment that they think this is the best course of action. Now, they can be wrong, but the idea is it's not like they said, I want to quit, therefore I'm going to go do the drugs. It's, I'll quit next time. Like, there's a rationality to their progression of thought and action that when you use the term irrational, when people are using it, they're not using the term irrational properly. They're conflating it with a bad decision.
But isn't being irrational?
No, irrational is lacking ration, right? So that's where I'm hungry, I'm going to go take a poop. Like, those,
Right.
you could have progress.
Okay. So when we look at, one of the concepts that behavioral economics talks about is loss aversion, right? So people tend to weigh losses more than gains when making decisions, or losing something makes people roughly twice as miserable as the happiness from gaining the same thing. Loss aversion. So in for some of us who are athletes, we say the term, I hate losing more than I like winning.
Yes. I hate losing every time after a game that I lost.
Right. Okay. And then, so then the next behavioral economic concept is regret is a powerful concept. So we feel more pain of loss if we believe we were close to avoiding the loss, or people do not fear change, they fear the loss. So the way how this relates to climate change is that climate change is, for lack of a better term, I would say used to sell us fear and death of the earth.
Well, I would say
and death of
climate
us.
change is sold via fear.
Yeah. Sorry.
Right, just
Is that what I said? Yeah. That's what I meant. Yeah. Sold via fear, death of the earth, and ultimately the death of us. So there's concepts called alarmism and, catastrophic change. So there's mild change, and then there's the catastrophic change. And so the alarmism and the catastrophic change pushes fear.
Yeah, I mean it's a call to action, and they're calling you to action by fear. I mean, to kind of make a similar but different point, and I'll put there's a Facebook post by Tim Moen, the leader of the Libertarian Party, called "The Greatest Fear Voting Guide," and what it's like. His point behind the post is, you look at every party, they're telling you to vote based on what do you fear, right? So the Green Party their platform is selling you the fear of CO2 or climate change. The NDP is selling you fear of the free market. The Liberals are selling you fear of the Conservatives. The Conservatives are selling you fear of the Liberals. The People's Party of Canada is selling you fear of immigrants. The Libertarian Party is selling you fear of the government. And I think, your point about behavioral economics, just to contextualize my point properly is not to say that behavioral economics doesn't have good insights that we can use to understand how people behave. Mm-hmm. I think where I take issue with the behavioral economics is, to some extent, they're modifying the principles based on those observations. I would say the observations are right for the most part, but I then would apply them to the traditional concepts of economics of basic supply and demand, while accounting for other things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that for me, and prior to this study, climate change the fear of the world ending and alarmism and climate change doesn't affect me, because I know how the story ends, right? Jesus returns, slays his enemies, and the earth is renewed by heaven coming down to earth. And so because of this, I can now objectively weigh the evidence of the climate change arguments and not be swayed emotionally. So for me as a Christian, I guess I didn't realize it at the time, but yeah, I'm not afraid of the end of the world, and therefore I'm not emotionally driven to make a decision. So the fear tactics don't work with me, or nor should they work with any other Christians. But I'm sure there are Christians who the alarmism, catastrophic change, and the fear of the world ending through climate change is swaying them politically, socially, and economically in the way they approach this discussion, and I'm sure of it.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm generally disappointed with the discourse, because it's like, I remember, and I can pull this up in the show notes page. Bill Nye was on Tucker Carlson. Mm-hmm. And I know Bill Nye's, not really a scientist, but that's a different conversation.
Come on, man. You're ruining my childhood, man. Shout out to Bill Nye.
So, my point, though, what I'm trying to get at, he asked him a question and said, how much does human activity contribute to the climate change? Just give me a number. Is it 10%? Is it 90%? And there's no answer to that, right? We don't actually have an answer of how much humans are contributing. There's no scientific consensus on how much are humans contributing to climate change. And, that leads to really where I would say the start of my critique on Twitter is, I referenced a couple things, but one of my sub-comments was around this whole 97% claim that gets thrown out all the time. And the issue with that is, there's some, let's just call it data manipulation that goes into coming up with this 97%. There are a crazy amount of papers and I'll make sure I'll put it in my show notes page that breaks down. I mean, there's a couple articles. I got a video. But there's a lot of assumptions built into like this 97%. What they did was they basically took a whole bunch of studies, found them, and tried to say, okay, what percentage of the studies on climate come to the conclusion that man is the primary cause? The predicament is that, this guy's name is Cook. He runs the skepticalscience.com website, John Cook. In his paper from 2013 is where he got this 97%. He basically was surveying the papers out there, and he kind of came up with a classification that said, okay, these papers concluded that man was the primary cause. Then there's a second group of papers that he said, oh, they implied that man was the cause. And then the funny part was, like, he took another group of papers that, kind of said, oh, I'm going to assume that it says that the cause is man, even though there was no explicit claim or even no inclination of a claim of who was the cause. And there's a whole bunch of papers that he just didn't include. And so, this 97% statistic, there's two problems with it. One, I would say it's data manipulation. But the second is it's a logical fallacy the way it's thrown around. It's essentially an appeal to an authority, which is something in a logical argument. You say, oh, just because Joe Schmo, who's a PhD in something, says something, therefore we're going to believe it. No, that like credentials don't justify your position. The facts and the data underlying it justify the position. And the reason I bring this up is to speak to the fact that the discourse on this is being shut down so much by just saying, well, 97% of scientists agree. What do they agree on? I guarantee you ask someone, what do they agree on? Oh, man-made climate change. Well, how did they come to that conclusion? They don't know the answer. People don't understand where this data came from, how it was arrived at, how it was derived. And it's just shutting down conversation in a way that's kind of what you're hinting at, right? And that's where I kind of went down that road, was just the way the discourse on this is. It's disturbing from a perspective of it's being used to promote more government intervention without, as well just assuming, oh, it's man-made climate change. And I would say majority of the arguments for man-made are purely correlation, i.e., oh, we've seen more temperature increases, or we've seen, we basically, rising sea level, average temperature increases, ocean temperature, shrinking glaciers, ocean acidification, all these things that like statistically may be true, but the question is causation versus correlation. And the scientific data is totally lacking. I mean, this is something like, I remember digging so deep into this. I like spent probably a crazy amount of hours watching documentaries, reading stuff on the internet, just trying to give me the science. And it was disturbing how hard it was to really come to the statistical modeling to say, okay, what are they really arguing? And at the end of the day, I would say it comes down to, CO2 is increasing with this unknown causation effect, or not unknown is not the right word, not completely understood causation effect on the climate. And this is where our models being, the publicly accepted IPCC models, have actually done a really poor job of predicting what's going to happen since they've started releasing their models. If anyone knows about this, the hockey stick curve and so on and so on. Yes, they've revised it, but they continue to revise and they continue to fail at predicting, which to me, if you can't predict in the future, well, how am I going to trust that we're going to be, everyone's going to be under the sea level? If that's your prediction, like AOC, in 12 years.
Who's AOC?
It's your favorite girl, don't you know?
No, I say that because
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's part of the squad,
Yeah.
in the U.S. But I mean, she put out the Green New Deal saying, like, essentially we have 12 years before catastrophic climate change. But again, These are people putting out predictions that keep failing at predicting. So, again, I know I've kind of went on a rant on a sidebar. I know for me, I've dug into the science and I've really I've looked at it from an inquisitive perspective. I didn't want to have a preconceived conclusion one way or the other.
Yeah, I think for me, who hasn't looked into it and could care less about climate change, to be honest, one of the things, coming back to behavioral economics, one of the principles that stood out for me was the concept of anchoring. So anchoring is a cognitive bias that describes the common human tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information offered or the most familiar piece of information when making decisions. So as I was studying, I was recalling and I was realizing, I can't remember who pointed this out, but that climate change is another word for global warming. And I know global warming because I was taught it in school. And I remember, as a little boy in elementary school, being taught about global warming, about pollution, taking care of the environment. And if we don't, we're all going to die one day. And it's funny because now I'm a grown man and I still remember those. I don't remember much from school, which is funny. I don't remember much, but I do remember global warming and those lessons about, the world's going to end, if you don't throw your juice box in the garbage. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and I think, that's the juice box in the garbage thing. I think it's a good time to bring up, like, both me and you hold a view that, like, we need to take care of this earth.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's stuff around, pollution and garbage and, where I would say I'm in total agreement with the fact that we do a horrible job of taking care of this earth. Have we done things to destroy coral reefs? And so if anyone's kind of being, concerned that we're like anti the earth or we don't care, God's coming back, so I don't have to worry about this planet. Well, I would say, like, that actually goes against, part of God's mandate for man, right? We're called to take care of this earth, right? So there's an aspect where, I just want to make sure it's clear that it's not misunderstood that, we're not at all trying to dismiss the need to take care of the earth. But I think your point about anchoring, there's a similar, the second thing you said about the most familiar, there's a term of, like, confirmation bias.
Yep.
Right. So if someone plants a seed of, as you said, like you're about to tell this story when you were a kid, right? The more your, parents drive around, right? I mean, we were talking about this earlier, right? You were saying to me, one of the things was, like, the more you drove around, people were like, oh, the more you drive, the more you're causing damage to the earth, right? And so it's just like, as a kid, you're given this idea that, again, has a very loose scientific basis because it's not full. The cause and effect relationship is not fully understood. That it's implanted into your brain. Oh, dirty energy, and that kind of like, pollution, CO2 is pollution. Meanwhile, CO2 is what humans exhale and what plants inhale. So it's pollution's not a proper term.
Yeah, true. No. I agree.
And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So no, I was just saying that, like, part of this is, like, bringing about, like, rational ignorance, another behavioral economic term. Like, rational ignorance is, like, low information voting. So it depends more on media instead of researching it themselves. So it's just more convenient to rely on the media to do the work for us versus, like, because you've done a lot of work, Joel, in studying, and that's not normal. Like, people don't do that. So some people,
you find someone who you think you can trust, and you let them tell you what conclusion they came to.
Yeah.
There's certain things. I think the term you use were, like, rational ignorance. It's, what you're really saying is they made a rational decision based on the information they know.
Yeah.
The problem is, and I've said it before, there's, like, three groups of information. There's the things you know, there's the things you don't know, but But the third area, I think, is where rational ignorance comes in. It's the things you don't know that you don't know.
Right. And so what ends up happening is, so for example, like understanding how special interest groups work in that cycle. So the way how environmentalists and these are not just environmentalists, but special interest groups that we all need to be aware of and how they function. So for the sake of conversation, we're talking about climate change, so we'll talk about environmentalists. So the benefits are concentrated on a small group, the environmentalists. The benefits being money. So the costs are spread out widely over a large group, which is everybody in regards to paying taxes.
Right, so we're all taxed a penny, and that accumulates to $100,000 given to a special interest group.
And then the special interest groups provide assistance to the election costs of public officials. So that's why you see politicians, not necessarily, usually we're getting our message about climate change not from scientists, but from politicians, from environmentalists, and from
Special
media
interest
outlets.
groups.
Yeah, special interest groups. So these are the things we need to consider when we are making decisions about climate change. So Joel, what's your 2 cents?
Yeah, I mean, I
that
think
you want to leave the audience with.
Yeah, I think you got a good point there, and like considering our audience. I mean, that's not it's not like, oh well, there's an oil company, therefore I can't trust their studies. But where that plays out, I think, is the government in general would be better off as an organization if they could justify a carbon tax. Well, how do they justify a carbon tax? Well, by proving it's man-made. So is the government ever going to subsidize or pay for a study that is going to prove it's not man-made? Like they're not interested in that, right? They have no financial incentive to show that climate change is naturally occurring. So why would they ever fund a study of such? And similarly, the gas and oil industry is not going to fund a study that's telling you that we're all going to die in 12 years, right? If that's the goal of the study. And so, I mean, this is an example to some extent of how our scientific community is a slightly, I don't want to say corrupted, but the financial system going along with science has problems. And so just understanding, okay, there's as you referred to the idea of bias a little bit differently earlier, but okay, what's the bias of those who produce the study? Doesn't mean you discount the data. It doesn't mean, but it means you need to be critical, thinking, okay, how do I look for a bias? Is the study structured in such a way that I can only come to one conclusion? So for the listener, it's not as simple as government intervention to solve the problem. There's much more of a spectrum. And again, I said I was going to share my tweet. My 2 biggest criticisms within my tweet response. One was about, the 97% being thrown around, and essentially my critique towards them was that, they're straw manning the position of rejecting rejecting man-made climate alarmism while still being concerned of climate change. So there's an ability to have a position that around climate change that doesn't say, oh, I need a carbon tax in order to, switch over to fossil fuels as soon as possible, or switch away from fossil fuels as soon as possible, because those are killing us at an unprecedented rate. We're all going to die soon. Like there's a spectrum of responses. For example, the other part that I shared was an economist, Robert Murphy, who's involved with energy and has done studies to say, economically speaking, we would be better off to resolve these issues as they arise than to try to prevent them. Well, and when I say better off, what I mean is the financial cost today would be more detrimental in the long run for us than using the resources in the 50 years from now when these problems arise, or 20 years from now when these problems arise. So essentially, we're hindering the economic growth by taking the money out of the system and using it to battle climate change. And his economic arguments are using all of the government data, right? All the IPCC data, all of their assumptions. He's not saying, well, let's assume this is right and this is wrong. And no, it's just, we're going to take their data and apply the economic principles and conclusions that they're giving us and say, okay, well, what's a better option? And so for the listener, again, it comes back to this idea of like government intervention isn't as simple as the only solution. it's a much more complex issue than as simple as like carbon tax is the only answer, and anyone who's anti-carbon tax is anti the earth. So Darnell, for the listener, what do you want to leave them with? What's your 2 cents?
I think we have to ask the question why we have pollution in the first place. So looking at it from a biblical theological standpoint, we're looking at God gives Adam and Eve the creation mandate or the cultural mandate in Genesis chapter 2 verses 16 to 18, and then also in Genesis chapter 6 the command to steward creation for the benefit of others. And so we see Adam and Eve doing that, but then sin enters the creation and the ground is corrupted as well as the sky. And so we have humans using limited resources to the best of their ability, which is creating the pollution. But we know that one day Jesus Christ will return, and therefore we have no fear. So in light of that, we have to become better stewards of the gifts he's given us, fossil fuel, coal, oil, solar power, and using it to the best of our ability to promote human flourishing. So we shouldn't be fear tactics, alarmism shouldn't motivate us to make decisions to steward the earth. We have a command to do that. We want to love our neighbor, and we want them to have clean water. We want them to have all the benefits that God has given us.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have that responsibility to take care of the environment through those means, through those means, rather than doing it through
Definitely.
fear.
So I just want to jump on the clean water idea. I think, it's a good just to finish the audience with a good example of rational ignorance. I think, when it comes to fracking and the conversation around clean energy, there's a rational ignorance that for majority of human history and for a large portion of the world today, clean water is not the default position. Dirty, contaminated water is the default position. And so, when you think of something like fracking, if it causes water to be no longer clean, yeah, that's a problem, but that's the norm. The norm is that water is dirty. And so if you're making a decision that something is causing water to become contaminated, it's like, I would say you're being rationally ignorant to the fact that it starts out as contaminated and needs to be cleaned for human consumption, especially when you're talking about water at that level. But, you think of how many people talk about putting wells in Africa or different places around the world that are considered third world countries. And so, access to clean water is something of high importance. And the best way to get there is cheap energy. And cheap energy is not as simple as renewables. So, we can definitely save the conversation around other sources of energy and getting into maybe an energy conversation on another episode. But I think for the listener, really questioning some of their presuppositions when it comes to this debate is a good place to start.
If you want to get in contact with us, you can contact us Facebook, Sixth Sense Report, or Twitter, or Sixth Sense Report account. You want to get in contact with me, do good at Darnell on Twitter or Instagram. That's DOGUDDA_Darnell.
And I'm at TJoelN39 everywhere.
And remember, Sixth Sense makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?